I put up a poll for videos to make this week, and from 37 votes, the highest vote was why does position sticky not stick sometimes? So let's answer that question in this video. I have a demo which I'll be using to show you two major reasons why your position sticky doesn't work sometimes. Now, when you look at the MDN docs for position sticky, it says the element is positioned according to the normal flow of the document and then offset relative to its nearest scrolling ancestor and containing block, which is the nearest block level ancestor. To fully grasp how position sticky works, you have to keep two concepts in mind: the nearest scrolling ancestor and the nearest block level ancestor. And I'll show you what this means in this video. So back to my demo here. I have this with some content. I have the code here. In the HTML part, I have this div with the class of heading, which is in a heading wrapper and in a main. And for my styles in the main here, I have a border of red, and for the heading wrapper, I have green, so that you can easily see what is the main and what is the heading wrapper. On my heading here, I put the position of sticky and I put a top of 30 pixels. So I expect this to stick 30 pixels to the viewport as I scroll. But as I scroll, the sticky isn't working. Why is this the case? First, let's identify what is the nearest block level ancestor. The nearest block level ancestor of this heading is this div with a class of heading wrapper, because by default divs have a display of blocks, so they are block level elements. If this wasn't here, let me comment it, then the nearest block level ancestor is going to be the main. But let's start with heading wrapper. What about our nearest scrolling ancestor? The nearest scrolling ancestor here, which is the only one by default, is the viewport. So when I scroll from the top to the bottom, I'm scrolling from the top of the viewport to the bottom of the viewport. Now, when I come here to say top 30 pixels, what I have to keep in mind is that this top 30 pixels is going to be positioned to the nearest scrolling ancestor, but there is a condition: as long as there is space in the nearest block level ancestor. This is the basic explanation of how position sticky works. So when you say top 30 pixels now, this is going to be 30 pixels to the viewport, which is probably from this point here to somewhere around here. But the condition is as long as there is space in the nearest block level ancestor, which in our case is heading wrapper. So now as I'm scrolling, there is no extra space in the heading wrapper, which you can see with the green border. So that's why we don't have anything sticky. And when we scroll, it just goes in normal flow. But let's say we add some space to the heading wrapper. So I'll come here and let's just say we make this height 500 pixels. Now I refresh. Now we have some extra space here in the heading wrapper. Our sticky is now going to work. So as I scroll, you can see that it now sticks to 30 pixels of the nearest scrolling ancestor, the viewport, and it sticks there as long as there is space in the heading wrapper. We have some extra space here, so it keeps sticking and sticking until there is no space anymore, and then it goes off the screen. Same thing if I scroll down. Let me make the top here 70 pixels. You can see it sticks at 70 pixels, 0 pixels. You can see it keeps scrolling until it gets to 0 pixels of the viewport, and it sticks there as long as there is space in the nearest block level container or ancestor, and when there is no space, it now goes off the screen. So one way we have solved this now is by creating extra space in the heading wrapper. But in this case, I don't want it to stick to the heading wrapper. I want it to stick to the main. So what do I do there? I'm now going to remove this nearest block level ancestor. So now the nearest block level ancestor we have is the main. Let me take this back to 30 pixels. So now if I refresh, we don't have the heading wrapper anymore. Nearest block level ancestor is the main. So when I'm scrolling in the viewport, you can see it sticks to 30 pixels of the viewport, the nearest scrolling ancestor. I keep scrolling, keep scrolling, keep scrolling. There is still space in the nearest block level ancestor, and I keep going until I get to the end of the nearest block level ancestor and it flows out of the document. Another thing I can do is I can keep the heading wrapper, but then I can come here to make this display inline. So by using inline, it's not going to be a block level element anymore. So the nearest block level element is still going to be the main. So I'm going to refresh again. Well, that also messes up the border. Let me just remove the border. So we have something like this. And if I scroll, you see the nearest block level ancestor is not heading wrapper because heading wrapper is no longer a block element. The nearest is the main and it scrolls until we get to the end of the nearest block level ancestor, and then it is removed from the screen. But instead of doing this as display inline, I would rather remove the element, or I'll put the element but instead put the position sticky and the top on the heading wrapper. So the nearest block level ancestor of the heading wrapper is the main, and now I have to change the height to, so I'm just going to remove the height, and now I have this, which still sticks to the nearest block level ancestor. But I want to put my position sticky here, and I'll just come here to comment out the heading wrapper. So the first big reason why our position sticky is not working is most likely that the nearest block level ancestor to that element doesn't have enough space. So the solution would be to remove that block level element so that your sticky elements can be bounded or constrained by the block level elements that you care about. And if I don't want this to be bounded by the main, because as you can see, once we get to the end of main, it leaves the screen, then that means I'm going to take this out here. So now the nearest block level element is going to be body. So as long as body has space, it's going to stick. So if I refresh, now it is outside the main, and you can see that it sticks as long as the body element has space. But I'm just going to take this back to the main element. What is the second major reason why your position sticky might not work? Well, that's if you create another scrolling ancestor. By default, the nearest scrolling ancestor is the viewport. But if you create another scrolling ancestor as a parent to your element, then your top 30 pixels or whatever position is going to be to that element. And how do you create another scrolling context? Well, one way you can do that is by using overflow auto or overflow scroll, or even overflow hidden. Let's stick with scroll. Now, overflow scroll allows you to have a scrollable container, but by doing that, you create another scrolling context. So by putting overflow scroll to this main now, if I refresh, you can see it looks like it's not sticking anymore, but it's actually sticking. You just don't realize it, but it's not sticking the way you expect it to stick on the screen. Well, why is that the case? Now that main has its own scrolling context, it is now a scrolling element or a scrollable element. Let me put it that way. Here, when we have top 30 pixels, this top 30 pixels is now going to be again to the nearest scrolling ancestor. The nearest scrolling ancestor in this case is no longer the viewport or the body element. The nearest scrolling ancestor is now the main. So top 30 pixels is going to be top 30 pixels of main. So from this point to this point is 30 pixels. And I can actually show you if I change this to 0 pixels. Let me just remove the vertical padding. What you see now is that our top 0 pixels is to the nearest scrolling ancestor, which is the main, which is here. If I do this top 60 pixels, you're going to see we're going to have top 60 pixels of the nearest scrolling ancestor, which is main. But the problem now is that when we scroll on the viewport, main goes up. So even though this is still sticking, because it's sticking to main as a scrolling ancestor, that's why it goes up and then it's not sticking to the screen. But let's say on main, we now have a height of 500 pixels. For the heading, I'll just put 30 pixels. Now, if I scroll, you can see that this is actually sticking. So this is why your sticky might not work. You have a different scrollable container. So this is actually sticking to main. As we scroll in main, you can obviously see it sticking. But when we now scroll on the viewport, it no longer sticks. Like I said, if you use overflow auto, let me remove this height of 500 pixels. You can see it's the same thing. If you use overflow hidden, even though you don't even specify a height, it creates another scrolling context so it doesn't stick to the viewport. So the solution to this is to ensure that none of the ancestor elements of that particular element has its own scrolling context. By removing overflow hidden, it removes the scrolling context for main, and so the nearest scrolling context becomes the viewport or the body, and now this can stick to the top of that viewport until we are done with main, because main is still the nearest block level element. If you don't want to worry about a nearest block level ancestor, just take this outside and now the nearest block level ancestor is body, so your element will always stick. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to stick to this channel, please subscribe, like this video, and let me know in the comments what other wise CSS questions you have, and I'll probably make a video about it.